Hi there, I'm Papa Pete, and welcome to today's episode of the 125. The 125 is my YouTube show that's about the 125 original games that were released for the Intellivision between 1979 and 1989. It's a little bit different type of show because each episode actually consists of more than one video. I'm going to have the history review video, that's the one you're watching right now, and there's also going to be a gameplay video, so make sure you look for that one as well. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started on today's episode, a very special game that we had back when I was a kid. Today, we're going to look at Mattel Intellivision's Submarine. Submarine combat games have been a very popular genre of games since long before the big era of video games in the 70s and 80s. As early as the 60s, there were simple submarine and naval combat games introduced. For example, everybody knows about the game Battleship by Milton Bradley. Yeah, it's very, very simple, but it let people simulate some naval combat. I think this game was in every North American home because when I was looking for this, I found a copy of the box that I even had when I was a kid. Another classic actual submarine combat game was the mechanical action game, one that I'd love to have a copy of today, 1961's Sonar Sub Hunt.
That's how the Navy hunts subs. And that's what you do in Mattel's new Sonar Sub Hunt game. It's the exciting naval battle game where you use the sonar scope to sink your opponent's submarines. You scan the field with the sonar scope, get ready, and push the firing button. Here's what happens when you score a hit. That's one sub gone. Whether you score a hit or a miss, keep hunting the subs, but watch out for mines. They can cost you a turn. Here's how you place your subs and mines. Then you watch through your periscope while your opponent tries to find them with the sonar. The first one to sink 7 subs wins the game. See if you can sink the subs in Mattel's Sonar Sub Hunt game. See it wherever toys are sold. And remember, you can tell it's Mattel. It's swell.
Over time, fans of naval combat games wanted more and more detail, more and more realism in their gaming experience. Complex board games such as 1979's Torpedo, 1978's Upscope, 1974's Wolfpack, as well as Avalon Hill's classic 1978 game simply titled Submarine, they introduced the incredible complexity and detail desired by gamers at the time. These games proved to be so complex, though, that casual gamers either couldn't or just weren't willing to put in the hours and hours it took to learn how to play these games. With the video game boom of the 70s, it was only natural that submarine games would be created. The restrictions of the technology at the time, though, that really brought it back to a much more simplistic era that could be enjoyed by the masses. I still fondly remember going to the arcade back in the mid-70s or going to the store and seeing 1976's Seawolf standing there in the corner, and I used to just love to play that game. With its faux periscope and probably a stool for me to stand on, I was so small at the time, I can remember going and shooting the torpedoes out of the bottom at the ships that were going by up top, and the mines, of course, would get in the way, but I was probably so young I was just happy to hit anything, so I didn't know if I was scoring points or hitting the mine or what. But the bottom line was, even though it was simple, it was an incredibly fun game. In a similar vein as Seawolf, the Atari 2600 had the Sears-only release, Submarine Commander. It played a lot like Seawolf in a lot of respects, but it really didn't pull it off nearly as well as the arcade version. Another submarine game that was out for Atari back in the late 70s, early 80s was the Activision title Seaquest. But frankly, it was more or less just a shooter. It could have been anything. It just happened to be a submarine, and so it really wasn't a good replication of naval combat. Basically, the limitations of the home consoles made it very difficult for the programmers to introduce the details, the specific aspects that were so desired in submarine gameplay. Somehow, they needed to find a balance between the hyper-complexity of the submarine board games of the era and the video games which are really, quite frankly, overly simplistic. games striving for this balance were soon being developed for the home computer market, but it was Mattel who first decided to bring a more simulation-style submarine combat game into the home console market. As with most of the early Mattel Intellivision games, this game was also developed by APH Technological Consulting, and it was released on May 6, 1982. It was the 30th release for the Intellivision System. In fact, it was the second release by programmer Tom Loughry, who had previously made Boxing, which I reviewed in the 125 episode 5. He went on to release a couple other games that I'm absolutely sure you've heard of. His third and fourth games were Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, also known as Cloudy Mountain or Crown of Kings, and its sequel, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Treasure of Tarman. Now, after he left Mattel or APH Technological Consulting in 1983, he went on to work for Cheshire. And for Cheshire, through the Activision name, he also created and released the Dreadnought Factor, as well as Wormwhopper. So really, that's quite a portfolio of games for Mr. Tom Loughry. In Sub Hunt, the player, or the captain as I like to call it, controls a fleet of 4 submarines, and your task is to move your submarines and intercept 6 separate convoys of 6 enemy ships each as they enter the screen from the west. They're going to the northern harbor, which is the staging harbor, where they're trying to meet up with 3 enemy destroyers. If they do get up to that northern staging harbor, they team up with the 3 destroyers, and they mount an attack on your home base, which is at the lower right-hand side of the screen. On the deployment screen, you control the movement of your subs with the disc, and you also select which sub you're using with the buttons on the keypad, as well as stopping them. The object is to intercept the enemy convoys as quickly as possible with one of your submarines, at which time you hear a siren go off, the ships start to flash, and it's time for general quarters. The battle is about to begin. When you enter the second phase in Sub Hunt, you're in full control of your submarine on the sonar screen. You'll hear the sonar ping as you track the enemy convoy approaching from the west, or the left-hand side of the screen. There are 3 main elements that the captain uses to control their sub. There's depth, there's rudder, and finally there's speed. And these are all represented by instruments right in the middle of the sonar screen. Now, also active on this sonar screen is the periscope window. Now, the periscope window was also at the top of the deployment screen, but you didn't see anything in it. It is fully active here in the sonar screen, and this is what you'll use not only to change the direction of your sub, but also to aim and fire your torpedoes and to sink the enemy ships. So let's discuss the 3 different elements that the captain uses to control their sub. The first one, the instrument that's on the right, is S, which stands, of course, for speed. As captain of the sub, the player sets their speed with the telegraph symbols on the keypad. The 5 possible settings are stop, quarter speed, half speed, 3/4 speed, and of course, full speed ahead. A white line will appear on the speed instrument indicating how fast your sub's going. You may also notice on the overlay that the lower side buttons are reversed. Yes, you can go in reverse in your sub as well, but basically when you hold in the lower side buttons, your sub will just move in reverse at the appropriate speed that you had already selected. The white line in the speed indicator moves into the red when you are pushing on these buttons and going in reverse. It's really a strategy for evading enemy attack, so we'll talk more about reverse later on. Now, aside from speed, the captain also selects the direction that the submarine faces and moves using the rudder. The player uses the left and right sides of the disc to move the rudder to the right, which is hard starboard, or to the left, which is hard to port. Now, if the sub is moving, this will alter the direction that the sub points. You can see the white line moving back and forth on the instrument as you push on the disc, changing the direction of your rudder. You can also tell which direction your sub is pointing by looking at the compass indicator that's at the very top part of your periscope view, and you'll find that you're going to use that more than anything. As you move forward and you press on the rudder, you'll notice the direction changing up on that very top compass, and that is how you steer and you direct your ship. Basically, the rudder won't do anything on its own. You have to be moving forward for it to be able to take effect and change the direction of your ship. This is why it's so important to be able to use your speed and your rudder together to properly navigate. Now, the third and final element that every sub-captain has to be familiar with is the depth. And it's on the far left-hand instrument, and it's marked obviously with a D. The captain's in full control of the depth of the sub by using the dive and the surface buttons that are on the keypad. Just like the other instruments, a white line will indicate the depth of your ship. You can also tell your depth to some degree from the view through your periscope. When the white line is to the far right and the sky above the horizon is light blue in your periscope view, your sub is surfaced. When the white line is right on the depth indicator divider and the sky above the horizon is a pinkish color, the sub is at periscope depth. It's very important to take note that the captain can only fire torpedoes when they're at one of these two depths. That's either surfaced or at periscope depth. From periscope depth, if you continue to push the dive button, the sub dives an additional 20 feet with each movement of the indicator. Below periscope depth, you can no longer see anything in the periscope view, except the deep blue of the ocean. And occasionally, and unfortunately, once in a while, you may possibly see some flak from depth charges, but more on that later. Finally, one other very important thing that you have to remember when you're submerged is you're always going to be 25% slower in speed than you are when you're surfaced. So at this point, we know how to strategically place our subs on the deployment screen, and we also know how to navigate our subs on the sonar screen, so it's time to mount an attack. As I mentioned earlier, each enemy convoy consists of both troop transports as well as escort destroyers. As you approach the enemy convoy from the east with your sub, it'll be flashing rapidly, but when you get close enough, it goes to a slow flash, and undoubtedly at that point you'll probably get detected. Remember, factors such as engine noise, active sonar, as well as your depth, it'll affect how easily your sub is detected and how vulnerable you are to damage. For this reason and the fact that deck guns can harm you when you're surfaced, and the escort destroyer will undoubtedly advance and attack you, dive to periscope depth immediately and line up your sub to start firing your torpedoes. If you can manage to sink that enemy escort destroyer on that very first pass, then it's going to make your job that much easier when it goes to taking out the rest of the troop transport ships. The troop transport ships still drop depth charges at you, but they attack with much, much less ferocity than the original destroyers. Now, actually, in higher difficulty settings, there are 2 escort destroyers per convoy, and that is much more challenging. And remember, if the ships, the convoy, do manage to get to the staging harbor when they mount that final attack on your home base, that fleet is going to have 3 escort destroyers, so it's going to be a real challenge. The task here, sink those convoys as quickly as you can. Now back to the basics of launching the attack. You see the 2 torpedo-like symbols on the far right-hand side of the screen? Well, those are your torpedo tube indicators, and basically if they're green, that means that you have torpedoes loaded. When you fire one, it turns red, and it takes several seconds for it to load back up. Now you can only fire 1 torpedo at a time, or at least have 1 torpedo on the screen. You'll be able to fire the second one before the first one reloads, because like I said, it takes quite a while. But at the end of the day, there's no limit on the number of torpedoes that you have. It's just a limitation of the time it takes in between firing. So ultimately, as a submarine captain, you have to aim your torpedoes by lining up your submarine using the rudder and speed, and fire at the appropriate time. Also remember, sometimes you have to lead your enemy because the direction and the speed of the enemy ships also affects your aiming. As you sink each ship, the number that's indicated in the upper right hand corner, sort of like opposite where the torpedo tube indicators are, shows a total number of ships that you've sunk. And if you do manage to sink all 6 ships in a convoy, you're automatically taken back out to the deployment screen to wait for the next convoy to show up. So far, I think I've made it sound pretty easy to win this game, but what happens when your attack doesn't go quite so well? You get in on top of your destroyer, you don't manage to fire and hit him, and all of a sudden he's right on top of you, firing his deck guns if you're surfaced, or dropping depth charges if you're at periscope depth or below, man, your only choice at that point, because you don't have any chance of outrunning them. You could possibly try to use your reverse button off and on, like I mentioned before, to try to bring them back around into a point of view, where you can fire torpedoes at them, but it's very difficult to do. What you're most likely going to have to do is use stealth to try to lose the destroyer above and somehow just sit and wait out his attack. So how do you go full stealth mode? Well, first of all, you dive as deep as you can. Don't forget as well, engines make noise, so turn off your engines. And last but not least, something you may not have thought of, you'll see that sonar button on the overlay. Well, you could turn off the sonar, which means you can no longer see the ships on the sonar screen, but they can't hear your ping either. Now, as you're down in the depths of the sea, it's kind of harrowing, because the destroyer is going to continue to drop depth charges trying to sink your sub. And you can tell by the sound, how loud the depth charges are when they're exploding, whether that's getting louder or getting fading and getting quieter as it goes, whether the destroyer is moving away from you or even coming towards you. And sometimes if they're coming towards you, it may even be worthwhile to hit your right a little bit and kick on your engines for just a second, just long enough to give yourself a little bit of momentum and movement, but not long enough for the enemy destroyer to hear you up above. The enemy destroyers will continue to circle your last known location. They're pretty persistent. They'll keep dropping depth charges, and all you can do is wait it out, make some minor evasive maneuvers, and hopefully, if you're lucky, they'll move away, they'll give up, and basically you'll be able to tell on the screen because your sub on the sonar screen will start flashing rapidly again. If you're unlucky, the depth charges just keep getting closer and closer. You may even see them in your periscope screen. If it breaches the hull, the seawater rushes in, massive crash, your ship goes to the bottom, your sub's gone, and you have one left to try to kill the other convoys with. If you do manage to survive, you'll notice again, because like I said before, your ship starts flashing faster again. You're no longer engaged, basically. You probably are safe to turn on your sonar again. You can see where they are. They'll be off to the east. You can, if you want, try to surface or try to at least speed over to catch them, but there's two reasons why you don't. First of all, well, you're not nearly as fast as them. It's going to have a hard time catching them, and you're not in a good position to attack anyway. So what you can do in that case is you use the return button that's on your overlay, and that takes you back out to the deployment screen. From the deployment screen, you can circle back around and intercept that same convoy once again. Then you're attacking again from the east. You can engage them the same way, try the battle all over again. Any ships that you've already sunk, they're going to be gone. Only the ones that remain will be on the screen, obviously. So remember, though, that return button only works. It only takes you back out to the deployment screen when you're not engaged with the enemy. In other words, you can't be flashing slowly. You have to be flashing quickly on the sonar screen. Well, now you know the basics of sub-hunt gameplay, so good luck and have fun. Now, before I tell you about how you win the game, or talk about winning the game, let's talk about how you lose the game. Obviously, if you lose all 4 of your subs, you're going to lose. But it isn't what actually loses the game for you. What loses the game for you is when the enemy convoys reach the staging harbor and they manage to get their new fleet together and attack your home base. If they enter your home base, that's when you lose the game. So, ultimately, how do you win? Well, if you sink all 36 of the enemy ships, all 6 convoys, yes, you obviously win. But one other thing to remember is the ultimate goal is to not let the enemy take over your home base. So it is possible to also not have enough of the enemy ships remain in order to meet in the staging harbor and form that fleet to attack your home base. If you do manage to win the game, the 3 enemy destroyers that were in the staging harbor, they take off and they go off the screen to the far west, and you get a rousing victory song. Something that's really special on the Intellivision system. The first time I heard it, I loved it. Ride of the Valkyries. The graphics in Sub-Hunt aren't flashy by any stretch of the imagination, but they are, by all intents and purposes, very, very adequate. The two different main screens, the deployment screen and the sonar screen, are very well laid out, with the maps at the bottom and the periscope view at the top. It's good that it's there even though it's not used in the deployment screen, because it just brings different elements and a different feeling of realism into the game when you go into that sonar screen. All the information that you need to navigate the ship or control your deployments are very clearly laid out on the two screens, sonar screen and deployment screen. And there's no confusion. It's easy to tell where you are, your depth, your speed, your reverse, your rudder. It's all very, very clear. It's just well laid out. And as for the actual graphics of the enemy ships and the torpedo that you're firing, I mean, it's very small. There aren't a whole lot of detail to the ships that you're attacking. There's only two different kinds, right? The troop transports, and there's also the escort destroyers. But that's all you really need. It meets the needs to have a fun, really in-depth experience while you're playing the game. But if I'm going to talk about the one thing that I enjoy the most graphically in this game, it's the tension that builds up when you're submerged underneath. You have an escort destroyer above you dropping depth charges, and you're looking at that blue periscope screen as you're underneath the water, just waiting to see if you see one of those depth charges. Because if you do see one of those depth charges in the periscope view, man, you know you're in for some heavy action, big explosion, and you don't know whether you're going to survive or not. It's really very well done. Subhunt has a lot of the very ordinary sounds that you see in a lot of these combat games. You have your similar explosions. You have the sounds of your engines, although the sound of the engines is really interesting because, of course, it changes from being on the surface or submerged. And also the sounds of your torpedo being fired and the sounds of them hitting the enemy ships. Very well done. Nothing too awfully special. I really do like the sonar ping. It's evident in other games like Sea Battle as well, and I think it's very well done and has a great ambiance to the game. Not only that, but it's incorporated into the gameplay itself with the fact that you could turn off your sonar and then you're not as visible to the enemy ships. So it's a very good idea. Very, very well used. But if I'm going to pick one sound that I like the most, it's that victory tune. The Intellivision rendition of Ride of the Valkyries is just excellent. And nothing wraps up and makes you feel satisfied for beating the game anymore than getting to hear that tune at the end. There's 5 different levels of gameplay that you can pick from the menu screen. You choose these from the menu screen, and they're noted by actually they're on the same buttons as the telegraph buttons, the speed buttons on the overlay. And you'll notice that there's from 1 star to 5 stars under these buttons. So 1 star and 2 star are the 2 easiest games, and then of course you have 3, 4, and 5. If you hit the disc from the menu screen, you also get the same as what is the 2-star game. And basically in the 1 or 2 star games, you get 1 enemy escort destroyer with each convoy, but in game difficulties 3, 4, and 5, there are 2 enemy escort destroyers, and this makes the game significantly more difficult. The destroyers are always going to be the lead of the convoy and the tail of the convoy. It's a good thing to know, because a lot of the times when you go and attack these convoys, those destroyers are what you want to focus on first to make it easier to take out the rest of the ships. Mattel Electronics Subhunt introduced so many details into the submarine combat genre of video games for the home consoles. It's really revolutionary. There's multi-screen strategy gameplay. There's varying speeds, depths, things such as different enemy attack configurations. All of these elements were brought in for the very first time, true innovations by Mattel in the field. Later on, I can still remember playing games like on the NES, there was Silent Service, as well as a game I played a ton of, I loved it, for the PC, Aces of the Deep, that expanded upon the things that were started by Mattel. When I was playing these games, I could recognize how the innovations that brought these games into being started with Subhunt. Great sounds, good graphics, innovative strategy, and basically, in essence, just a lot of fun to play. All of these factors taken into consideration, I have to give Mattel Electronics Subhunt a 7 out of 10 rating. Well, guys, that's it for today's episode of the 125. It's been a lot of fun going back and looking at Sub Hunt, a game I played a lot when I was a kid, but hadn't played a whole lot lately. And you know what? It really holds up well, and it's a game that's still fun to play in this day and age. Thanks for spending a little bit of time with me today. I can't wait to see you next time on the next episode of the 125. Take care.
Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. If you haven't grown up by the age of 50, you don't have
I'm Rick Reynolds of the Intellivisionaries podcast, and you're watching Papa Pete, the old guy gamer.